I never liked the idea of routine. The same office chair, the same coffee mug with a chipped handle, the same polite smiles exchanged with coworkers who barely knew me. Today, though, something cracked in me. I didn't want to sit through another meeting about quarterly projections or drown in emails that meant nothing. Around noon, I packed up my things, told my boss I wasn't feeling well, and headed home. I figured I'd surprise Diane. Maybe we'd have lunch together, spend the afternoon doing something spontaneous for once. She'd been telling me lately that I'd become too predictable. The sky was overcast when I pulled into the driveway. Our house sat there quietly, same as it always did. White shutters, a neatly trimmed lawn, and Diane's garden lining the path to the front door. I remember thinking how peaceful it looked, like the kind of house where nothing ever went wrong. The door wasn't locked. That didn't strike me as odd. Diane was usually home at this time, and she didn't always lock up. I stepped inside, the familiar scent of cinnamon and lavender candles hitting me instantly. It felt comforting, like stepping into a memory I didn't know I'd missed. I set my bag down by the door, kicked off my shoes, and called out her name. No answer. The living room was neat as always. Pillows perfectly fluffed, the coffee table spotless. Diane was a stickler for keeping the house in order. I figured she was probably upstairs folding laundry or watering the plants in the sunroom. But then I heard something, faint, like a creak followed by muffled laughter. It was coming from the back of the house, near the kitchen. At first, I thought she had the TV on, maybe watching one of those cooking shows she liked. But as I moved closer, the laughter became clearer, and it wasn't coming from the TV. I froze just before rounding the corner into the kitchen. The laughter stopped, replaced by hurried whispers and the sound of footsteps. My heartbeat quickened, and I could feel the weight of something heavy settling in my chest. I stepped into the kitchen, and there she was, Diane, standing by the island with her hair slightly disheveled, her cheeks flushed. She wasn't alone. Eric, our neighbor from across the street, was there too. His shirt was wrinkled, and he was holding a glass of water, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Diane's eyes widened when she saw me. "You're home early," she said, her voice a little too high-pitched. I didn't respond. My gaze shifted between the two of them, taking in the scene. The way her hand lingered on the counter as if she needed support, the way Eric avoided eye contact, the tension in the air so thick you could slice it with a knife. "Eric was just helping me with the dishwasher," Diane added, forcing a smile. The dishwasher wasn't running. I leaned against the doorway, folding my arms as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The disappointment hit me first, a wave of it crashing over me before the anger had a chance to take root. It wasn't about the dishwasher, and we all knew it. I didn't say a word, not right away. I let the silence hang there, stretching like a rope being pulled too tight. Diane shifted her weight from one foot to the other, tapping her fingers against the countertop as if she were waiting for me to speak, waiting for me to believe her lie. Eric, on the other hand, looked like he was contemplating the fastest way to disappear through the nearest exit. "Helping with the dishwasher, huh?" I finally said, letting the words roll off my tongue slowly, deliberately. Diane nodded, her eyes darting between me and Eric. "Yeah, it wasn't draining properly. I called Eric because he's good with this kind of thing." Eric cleared his throat, and I watched as a bead of sweat formed on his temple and slid down the side of his face. The guy had built decks and repaired fences for half the neighborhood, but suddenly fixing a dishwasher had him sweating like a criminal under interrogation. "Show me," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I want to see what's wrong with it." Diane blinked, her mouth opening slightly as if she hadn't expected that. Eric looked at her, waiting for her to take the lead. She swallowed, then forced another smile. "It's fixed now," she said quickly. "Eric just finished." "Then I guess I should thank him," I replied, my gaze locked on hers. "Or maybe I should check to make sure it won't act up again." Her breath hitched for just a second, but she recovered fast. "You don't have to. Really, it's fine now." I didn't move. The kitchen felt smaller, suffocating. I could hear the clock ticking on the wall behind me, each second dragging out longer than the last. "I'd like to see for myself," I insisted. Eric put down the glass of water and shifted uncomfortably. "Actually, I should get going," he said, wiping his hands on his jeans like they were suddenly clammy. "I've got a thing at home." I stepped aside, letting him pass without a word. He bolted toward the door, and I heard it close behind him a moment later. Now it was just me and Diane, standing in the middle of the kitchen where everything looked normal but nothing felt right. "Why are you acting like this?" she asked, her voice defensive now. "You're making it weird. Eric's been our neighbor for years. You know he's always helped us with things." I stared at her, studying the way her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her shirt, the way her eyes darted toward the window as if she couldn't bear to meet mine for too long. She was lying, and she wasn't even good at it. "Helping with the dishwasher, huh?" I repeated, the words tasting bitter this time. "That's the best you've got?" She crossed her arms, her posture stiffening. "I don't know what you're implying, but you're wrong. Nothing's going on. You're blowing this out of proportion." I leaned in slightly, closing the distance between us just enough to see the panic flickering behind her eyes. "Then why did he look like he was about to have a heart attack when I walked in?" I asked. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She was searching for an answer, scrambling for a way to convince me that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. "Maybe because you barged in like you were accusing us of something," she finally said, her tone sharp now. "You're making him uncomfortable, and you're making me feel like I'm under attack." I exhaled slowly, trying to rein in the anger that was bubbling just beneath the surface. "Diane," I said quietly, "if this was innocent, you wouldn't be acting like this." Her eyes flashed with something, guilt, fear, maybe both, but she quickly masked it with indignation. "I can't believe you don't trust me," she shot back. "I've never given you a reason to doubt me." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to convince myself that this was all in my head, that I was overreacting, but the cracks in her story were widening with every word she said. And deep down, I knew the truth was hiding somewhere between them. I just had to find it. That I left the kitchen without saying another word. If I stayed, I knew I'd end up shouting, and I wasn't ready for that yet. Not until I had more than just suspicion. Diane followed me into the living room, her footsteps light and hurried, as if she were afraid of letting me walk away without resolving this on her terms. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice trailing me like a shadow. "To think," I replied, grabbing the car keys off the side table. I didn't give her a chance to respond before I opened the door and walked out. The cool air hit me as I stepped outside, but it didn't help. My mind was spinning, replaying the scene over and over like a scratched record that wouldn't stop skipping. I sat in the car with the engine off, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing grounding me. Part of me wanted to drive away, to put miles between me and whatever Diane was hiding, but I knew running wouldn't fix this. I needed answers. I pulled out my phone, hesitating for a moment before scrolling through the call log. Eric's name was there, twice in the last week. Both calls had been outgoing, and both had come from Diane's phone. I checked the timestamps. One was on Wednesday afternoon, when I'd been stuck in a meeting at work. The other was Saturday evening, when she'd told me she was heading to the grocery store. My jaw tightened as I stared at the screen. She'd never mentioned calling him. And why would she? It wasn't like we needed his help that often. But maybe she wasn't calling him for help. I switched over to her text messages. She didn't delete them often, and I was counting on that. My heart pounded as I scrolled through her conversations, looking for his name. I found it buried under the usual chats with her friends and family. There weren't many messages, but the ones I found told me enough. "Thanks for the other night. I needed that. Can't stop thinking about you. He doesn't suspect anything." My hands trembled as I read the last one. It was from 2 days ago. The timestamp showed it was sent late at night, long after I'd fallen asleep. I leaned back against the seat, closing my eyes as the weight of it all pressed down on me. She hadn't just lied to my face. She'd been carrying this on behind my back, sneaking around and sending messages like we were strangers sharing a house instead of a married couple building a life together. But I wasn't just angry at her. I was angry at myself for not noticing sooner, for trusting her so blindly that I never saw the cracks forming until it was too late. I couldn't sit there any longer. I needed to confront her. When I walked back into the house, Diane was sitting on the couch, her knees drawn up to her chest like she was bracing herself for what was coming. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and glassy. "Where did you go?" she asked softly. I didn't answer. Instead, I held up my phone, the screen still showing her text with Eric. Her face drained of color. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. For once, she didn't have a quick excuse or a cleverly spun lie. "Don't bother denying it," I said, my voice low but steady. "I saw everything." She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "It's not what you think," she whispered. I laughed bitterly. "You really expect me to believe that? I saw the messages, Diane. I know you've been seeing him." She wiped her eyes, her breath hitching. "I can explain," she said, her voice cracking. "Then explain," I shot back, taking a step closer. "Tell me why my wife has been sneaking around with a neighbor and lying to my face." For a moment, she just stared at me, like she was trying to decide whether to come clean or spin another story. But instead of answering, she broke down, burying her face in her hands. And just like that, the fragile web she'd spun around us began to unravel, that I watched her crumble in front of me, tears soaking her palms, her shoulders shaking with every sob. If this had been a year ago, maybe even a month ago, I would have rushed to comfort her, wrapped my arms around her, and tried to make it better. But now, I just stood there, frozen between anger and disbelief, waiting for her to explain the mess she'd created. When she finally lifted her head, her face was flushed, her eyes swollen. She looked like she'd just survived a storm, but I wasn't in the mood to feel sorry for her. "Not yet. I didn't mean for this to happen," she said, her voice hoarse. "I swear to you, I didn't plan any of it." I didn't respond. I wasn't interested in whether she planned it or not. It had happened, and that was enough. "I was lonely," she continued, her gaze locked on the floor. "You've been so distant lately, working all the time, coming home late, barely talking to me. I felt invisible." "So you ran to Eric?" I asked, my voice sharp. "You couldn't tell me how you were feeling, but you could tell him?" She winced like my words had physically hurt her. "It wasn't like that at first," she whispered. "We just talk. He'd check on me when you were at work. I didn't think it was a big deal." Talking turned into late-night texts, I said, holding up my phone again, and God knows what else. "Don't act like this was innocent, Diane. I'm not stupid." Her eyes filled with fresh tears, and she shook her head furiously. I know it wasn't innocent, but it wasn't serious either. It didn't mean anything." I laughed, cold, bitter, and hollow. "It didn't mean anything? You've been lying to me, sneaking around and sleeping with a neighbor, and now you want to tell me it didn't mean anything? Do you even hear yourself?" She reached out as if she wanted to touch me, but I stepped back. Her hand fell to her side, and for a moment, she looked completely lost, like she didn't know what to do or say to fix this. "I was going to end it," she said quietly. I just didn't know how." I shook my head, the weight of her words sinking in deeper than I expected. "You should have ended it before it even started," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You should have come to me instead of him." Her tears kept falling, but I wasn't moved by them. Not anymore. I'd spent years believing we had something solid, something real. But now, it felt like I'd been living in a house made of glass, and one crack was all it took to shatter everything. "How long?" I asked, my tone flat. She hesitated, biting her lip as if she could somehow stop herself from telling me the truth. But I wasn't going to let her off the hook. "How long, Diane?" I repeated, louder this time. 3 months, she admitted, her voice barely audible. "It's been 3 months. 3 months of lies. 3 months of her pretending everything was fine while she was sneaking around with Eric." I felt the disappointment settle deeper in my chest, heavier than any anger I'd felt so far. I turned away from her, running a hand through my hair as I tried to think. Every memory I had of the past 3 months felt tainted now. Every dinner we'd shared, every weekend spent together, every time she'd kissed me goodnight. Had any of it been real, or was it all just part of the act? "You say it wasn't serious," I said, keeping my back to her. "But you risked everything for it. You risked us." She sobbed quietly behind me, but I didn't turn around. I couldn't. If I looked at her now, I wasn't sure if I'd break down or explode. "I didn't want to lose you," she cried. "I still don't. Please don't let this be the end of us." I closed my eyes, her words cutting deeper than I wanted to admit. But this wasn't something I could forgive with an apology and a promise. Not when the cracks in our foundation had spread too far. Not when she'd betrayed me in the worst possible way. I turned back to face her, my expression hardened. I don't know if there's an us to save Diane. Not after this. Her face crumpled, and she fell to her knees, sobbing like her world had just been ripped apart. But this time, I didn't feel like reaching down to pick up the pieces. I didn't stay to watch her fall apart. I turned and walked down the hallway, past the framed pictures of us smiling on vacations, at weddings, at family gatherings. The images seemed to mock me now, each one a reminder of the life I thought I had. I stepped into our bedroom, closed the door behind me, and sat on the edge of the bed. My mind raced, jumping from one thought to another like it couldn't land anywhere long enough to process the damage. The bed felt unfamiliar, like I didn't belong there anymore. I rubbed my hands over my face, trying to think straight. 3 months. 3 months of her lying to me, pretending everything was fine while she snuck around with Eric. And what made it worse was that she still had the nerve to deny the seriousness of it. It didn't mean anything. Her words echoed in my head, making me sick. If it didn't mean anything, why did it happen at all? Why did she risk everything we'd built over something meaningless? Or maybe that was the real lie. Maybe it did mean something, and she just wasn't ready to admit it yet. I heard a faint noise outside the bedroom window and instinctively stood up. I pulled back the curtain and looked out. Eric was across the street, standing in his driveway with his phone pressed to his ear. He was pacing, his free hand gesturing wildly, like he was in the middle of an argument. I watched him for a moment, the anger bubbling up again. I wanted to storm over there, grab him by the collar, and make him regret ever stepping foot in my house. But that wasn't going to fix anything. Not yet. I needed to understand the full extent of what I was dealing with before I acted on my anger. I turned away from the window, grabbed Diane's laptop from the nightstand, and sat back down on the bed. She wasn't great with passwords, and sure enough, it only took me 2 tries to get in. I opened her email first, scrolling through the recent messages. Most of them were harmless. Shopping receipts, newsletters, reminders for appointments. But then I found one that made my breath hitch. It was from Eric, sent 2 weeks ago. The subject line was blank, but the message inside wasn't. Had a great time last night. Can't stop thinking about you. Let me know when we can do it again. My hands trembled as I clicked on the thread. There were more messages, dating back months. They were careful, never mentioning anything too incriminating in case someone stumbled across them, but the context was clear. They'd been meeting regularly when I was at work, when I was out running errands, when I was too preoccupied to notice. I scrolled faster, scanning the messages for anything that stood out. One of them caught my attention immediately. It was from Diane. We have to be more careful. He's been suspicious lately. I clenched my jaw, the pieces falling into place. She hadn't just been sneaking around. She'd known I was catching on and tried to cover her tracks. The texts, the lies, the fake explanations about the dishwasher. It was all part of the same web of deception. But the next message I read sent a chill down my spine. What if he finds out? What if he confronts you? Eric's response was short but direct. Don't worry, I can handle him. I sat there, the weight of his words sinking in. I wasn't sure what he meant by handle, but the implication was enough to set off alarm bells. Had they discussed what to do if I caught them? Was he planning to intimidate me? Or worse? I closed the laptop, my mind racing. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about control, about how far they were willing to go to protect their little secret. I wasn't going to sit back and let them dictate how this played out. I stood up, fists clenched, and headed back to the living room. Diane was still on the couch, her face buried in her hands. She looked up when she heard me approach, her eyes red and swollen. Did you think I wouldn't find out everything? I asked, my voice low but dangerous. Her lips quivered. What do you mean? I held up the laptop, the weight of it feeling heavier than it should. I saw the messages, I said. All of them, including the one where you said I was getting suspicious. Her face went pale, and for a moment, I thought she might pass out. I didn't mean for it to go this far, she stammered. You didn't mean for it to go this far, I repeated, the words dripping with sarcasm. And yet, here we are. She stood up, taking a hesitant step toward me. Please, I can explain. Just let me. I held up a hand, stopping her in her tracks. Save it, I said. I've heard enough lies for one day. Her shoulders sagged, and she sank back down onto the couch. I turned away from her, my mind already working on what I had to do next. Eric thought he could handle me, but he had no idea what was coming his way. I left Diane sitting on the couch, her tears barely a whisper behind me as I made my way toward the front door. My steps were slow, measured, like my body knew that if I moved too fast, I might lose control of the rage pulsing through me. I didn't slam the door on my way out. I closed it gently, like I didn't want her to know just how close I was to exploding. The cool evening air stung my face as I crossed the lawn, each breath steadying me, grounding me into reality of what I was about to do. Eric's house sat directly across the street, its porch light casting a soft glow on the driveway. His car was still parked there, and the sight of it made my hands clench into fists. He was home. He wasn't hiding. Good. I didn't hesitate. I marched up his driveway and pounded on the door with enough force to make the glass rattle. I didn't care if his wife was home or if his kids were asleep. None of that mattered now. If he had the audacity to sneak around with my wife under my nose, then he could deal with the fallout right in front of his family. The door opened slowly, and there he was, standing in a plain white t-shirt and jeans, barefoot, like he was just about to relax for the evening. His face changed the moment he saw me, going from mild confusion to a flash of panic. He tried to cover it up quickly, but it was too late. I'd seen it. "Hey, man," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Everything okay?" I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "Don't play dumb, Eric. You know exactly why I'm here." He glanced over his shoulder, probably wondering if his wife was within earshot. "Look, I think we should talk about this somewhere else," he whispered, stepping out onto the porch and closing the door behind him. I didn't budge. "No, we're talking about this right here," I said. "I'm not giving you the luxury of hiding behind closed doors, just like you didn't give me the courtesy of staying out of my marriage." He rubbed the back of his neck, shifting uncomfortably. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he said, echoing the same pathetic excuse Diane had given me. "It wasn't supposed to go this far." "Let me guess," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "It didn't mean anything, right?" He winced, confirming that they'd both rehearsed the same line, thinking it would somehow soften the blow. But it only made me angrier. I stepped closer, narrowing the distance between us until I could see the sweat forming on his forehead. "You've been sneaking around with my wife for 3 months," I said, my tone deadly calm. "Sending her messages, meeting her behind my back, and now you want to stand here and tell me it didn't mean anything? Don't insult me, Eric." He swallowed hard, his atoms apple-bobbing like he was struggling to keep his composure. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I really am." I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "Sorry isn't going to cut it. You had no problem betraying me when you thought I'd never find out, but now that the truth's out, you want to apologize?" He opened his mouth to respond, but I didn't give him the chance. I took another step forward, my anger boiling over. "Did you think you could get away with it forever?" I asked, my voice rising. "Did you think I'd never notice how much time you were spending in my house? Or did you think I was too stupid to put the pieces together?" He took a step back, his hands raised as if he thought I might hit him. And for a brief moment I considered it. My fists itched with the urge to knock him to the ground, to make him feel just a fraction of the pain he'd caused me. But I knew that wouldn't solve anything. It would only give him another excuse to play the victim. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he said, his voice trembling now. "It just happened. We didn't plan it, I swear." "Stop lying," I snapped. "I saw the messages. You two planned plenty. You met up when you knew I'd be gone. You sent her texts late at night, and you had the audacity to act like nothing was going on when you saw me. So don't stand there and tell me it wasn't planned." He lowered his gaze, unable to meet my eyes. "What do you want me to say?" he muttered. "I want the truth," I said. "I want to know why you thought it was okay to destroy my marriage. Was it just about the thrill of sneaking around? Or did you actually think you had something with her?" He hesitated, his silence giving me all the answers I needed. He didn't know why he did it. Maybe it was the thrill. Maybe it was the excitement of crossing a line he wasn't supposed to cross. Or maybe he did have feelings for her, but he wasn't brave enough to admit it now that he was caught. I exhaled sharply, trying to calm the storm inside me. "You're going to stay away from her," I said, my tone cold and final. No more messages, no more visits, no more excuses to come over. If I see you anywhere near my house again, you'll regret it. He nodded quickly, like a child being scolded. Okay, I'll stay away. I promise. I didn't trust him, but I needed him to know that I wasn't bluffing. I turned and walked down the steps, my footsteps heavy on the pavement. I could feel his eyes on me as I crossed the street, but I didn't look back. When I stepped inside the house, Diane was still on the couch, her eyes swollen and her face blotchy from crying. She looked up at me, hope flickering in her gaze, but I wasn't ready to give her any answers. I talked to him, I said, my voice flat. What did he say? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Doesn't matter, I replied. What matters is what you're going to do next. I sat down across from her, leaning forward with my elbows on my knees. Because I'm not going to pretend this didn't happen, and I'm not going to just let it go. She wiped her eyes, her fingers trembling. I'll do whatever it takes, she said, her voice cracking. Just tell me how to fix this. I didn't respond right away. I wasn't sure if there was a way to fix it. The trust was gone, shattered like glass underfoot, and no amount of promises or apologies could glue it back together. But I wasn't ready to make that decision yet. You're going to tell me everything, I said, my tone cold and firm. No more lies. No more half-truths. If you want even the slightest chance of fixing this, you're going to come clean. And if I catch you lying again, we're done. Her breath hitched, and she nodded slowly, like she understood just how fragile her position was. But deep down, I wasn't sure if I cared anymore. Because once trust is broken, it's nearly impossible to rebuild. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to try. Diane sat across from me, her eyes wide, red, and desperate, like she thought spilling the truth would somehow save her. Maybe she believed there was still a version of this where we could go back to normal. But she didn't realize that the normal we had was already buried 6 feet under. Start from the beginning, I said, my voice cold and unforgiving. How did it happen? She stared at the floor, her fingers fidgeting in her lap. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she whispered. It started so small, just conversations. I didn't think, you didn't think, or you didn't care. I interrupted. She flinched, her eyes flicking up to meet mine. I didn't think it would get out of hand, she said. He came over one afternoon while you were at work. We were just talking about the neighborhood, about his job. I didn't see it as anything more at first. I leaned back in the chair, arms crossed, keeping my expression blank, even though I could feel my patience thinning. I didn't want to hear about casual conversations that just happened. I wanted to hear the moment where she made the choice, the moment she crossed the line. Then what? I asked, because I know it didn't stop at talking. She hesitated, chewing on her bottom lip. It was after the neighborhood barbecue, she finally said. Do you remember that night? I did. I remembered coming home that evening, tipsy from the beer. While Diane had excused herself early to help clean up, I hadn't thought much of it at the time. I trusted her. I trusted that if she said she was going to help, that's all it was. But now, the memory left a bitter taste in my mouth. He kissed me that night, she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't push him away. I should have. But I didn't. I exhaled sharply, biting the inside of my cheek to keep from lashing out. And that was it? Just one kiss? I asked, knowing it was a lie before she could even answer. No, she admitted, tears sliding down her cheeks. We met again. At first, it was just in passing. When you were at work, he'd stop by for coffee, and we'd talk. But it got worse. One day, it went further. We slept together. I clenched my jaw, my fingers tightening around the armrests of the chair. Hearing her say it out loud felt like a punch to the gut, even though I'd already known. There was something about the confirmation, about the words leaving her mouth, that made the betrayal hit harder. Where? I asked, my voice steady despite the chaos in my chest. She looked at me confused. What do you mean? Where did you sleep with him, Diane? I repeated, enunciating each word. Her face crumpled, and she buried her face in her hands. Once in his house, she sobbed. And once here. In our bed. Our bed. The place where we slept, where we'd made plans for the future, where we'd built a life together. I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor as I pushed it back. I walked to the bedroom without saying a word, her sobs following me down the hallway. When I reached the bedroom, I stood there for a moment, staring at the bed as if it were some kind of crime scene. I couldn't look at it without picturing them tangled in the sheets, whispering the kind of secrets that should have only existed between us. I tore the sheets off the bed, yanking them violently and throwing them into a heap on the floor. The pillows followed, then the comforter, until the bed was stripped down to the bare mattress. I didn't care if she saw what I was doing. I wanted her to see. When I walked back into the living room, her eyes widened at the sight of me carrying the pile of bedding. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Getting rid of this," I said bluntly. "Every trace of him. Every reminder." She stood up, wiping her tears away like she thought she could salvage this. "Please, we can fix this," she pleaded. "I'll do anything. We'll go to counseling. I'll quit my job if you want. Just don't give up on us." "Give up on us?" I echoed, laughing bitterly. "Diane, you gave up on us the moment you let him into our bed." Her shoulders sagged, and she sank back down onto the couch, sobbing into her hands again. I watched her for a moment, waiting to feel something, pity, forgiveness, anything, but all I felt was the cold weight of disappointment. I walked past her and headed for the front door, carrying the bedding out to the trash bins by the curb. The sun had started to set, casting a dull orange glow over the neighborhood. I dumped the bedding into the bin and closed the lid with a satisfying slam. When I walked back inside, Diane was still crying, her face buried in her hands like she was trying to disappear into herself. I stood over her, letting the silence hang heavy between us. "I'm leaving for a while," I said, breaking the silence. "I need time to think." She looked up, her face blotchy and tear-streaked. "Where are you going?" "I don't know yet," I replied. "But I'm not staying here." "Please," she whispered. "Don't walk away. We can fix this. We can get through it." I shook my head slowly, my gaze locked on hers. "I don't think you understand, Diane. This isn't something we can just fix. You broke something between us, and I don't know if it can ever be repaired." Her sobs grew louder, but I didn't stay to comfort her. I grabbed my keys from the table, walked out the door, and didn't look back. As I drove down the street, the weight of it all pressed down on me. The betrayal, the lies, the memories now tainted beyond repair. I didn't know where I was going, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't care. I just needed to keep driving, to put distance between me and the house that no longer felt like home. And in that moment, I realized something. Diane wasn't the only one who had been lying. I'd been lying to myself too, telling myself that things were fine, that we could work through anything, that she was still the woman I'd fallen in love with. But the truth was simple, harsh, and inescapable. Some things, once broken, can't be fixed.